Is it possible that the people of New Zealand may be offended? They were eating genetically modified corn.
Hard to believe, but it's been nearly 23 years since Corngate and the GE-free movement gripped the country. Now, after disappearing into the scientific wilderness, the topic of genetically modified organisms is back. But is it still a piping hot political issue?
Enabling gene technology is about backing farmers. It's about embracing growth, and it's about saying yes instead of no.
Say no to GMO! Hell no, GMO!
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detail today, a polarising topic, genetically modified organisms, the pros and cons. The contentious Gene Technology Bill has this week just closed public submissions. And earlier this month, in his State of the Nation speech, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon promised it would become law and it would help the agriculture sector.
I also want New Zealand scientists working on high-yield crop variants and solutions to agricultural emissions that don't drive farmers off their land and risk the very foundation of the New Zealand economy. And our political opponents can continue the scare campaigns of the early 2000s, but we will back the scientific community, we will push on, and we will get that law passed this year as well.
But critics argue deregulating gene editing technologies has wider consequences than the government has considered.
It is using a bulldozer to crack a nut.
That's Jack Heinemann, Professor of Genetics at Canterbury University. We'll hear more from him in a moment, along with senior political reporter Fox Meyer.
Some people have said it's an overcorrection, but no matter which way you're going to look at it, it's going to be a pretty seismic shift in the gene modification landscape here.
But first, a quick GMO history recap. Put simply, genetic modification involves taking DNA from the genome of an organism, like a plant or animal, and inserting it into the genome of another organism. And this makes a new substance or creates different functions. With conventional breeding, you crossbreed two varieties of a plant to combine two traits.
In the 90s, there was a big push to introduce new genetically modified seeds, and people rightly said, we want proper regulation. We don't want to see this in our fields and in our paddocks. And how does it fit with our reputation for being a producer of natural and safe food?
After widespread protests in the 1990s and early 2000s and a royal commission in 2001, New Zealand boasted tough genetic modification regulations. In fact, they were among the most stringent in the world. But overseas, the use of genetic modification or gene editing is now widespread. So, last year, our government pitched the landmark Gene Technology Bill as a vehicle for economic growth.
So we're ending a nearly 30-year restriction on gene technology outside the lab in a very carefully considered and tightly controlled move, which will bring enormous health, productivity and climate benefits to New Zealanders.
The government says the purpose of the bill is to enable the safe use of gene technology and regulated organisms in New Zealand. The intention is to establish a new regulatory regime for gene technology and GMOs. But Professor Jack Heinemann, a genetics engineer, has serious concerns.
They are taking an approach where some of the most powerful of our gene technology tools will be deregulated, which means that anybody can use them anywhere at any time. There is no analog technology of this power, and certainly no analog of historic gene technology techniques that have been this broadly deregulated. This legislation would take chemical components, there happen to be biological molecules that are also very potent mutagens, and allow people to use them anywhere without any kind of oversight. When we have done those kinds of operations historically, we've at least required that they be done inside of a registered containment facility so that we can control who is using them, who's exposed to them, and what happens to the things that we didn't want exposed, or to the things that were changed in ways that we didn't want them to be changed in. and make sure that those don't escape the laboratory and get into the environment. That's what we've done historically. This is the departure point for the bill as proposed for some of the most important, easily obtained, and powerful of the techniques we have available now.
The Prime Minister argues that it's good for farmers, for economic growth, and we need to be more yes, less no. What do you say to that?
Yeah, whatever. I think that's what you would say for any technology you're hoping will be a commercial success. It may very well be a commercial success. The indicators so far are not that it will be, but who knows? And we also have to make a distinction, too, between the use of this technology for producing medicines, which by their very nature will already be very carefully controlled and in containment facilities, and its use outside as a technology applied in the outside, not just as a technology that makes an organism that is then scrutinized, evaluated, amplified, and sold to farmers. That's just one imaginary of how this technology is used, that we make a GMO. We know exactly what that GMO is, and there's a commercial incentive to have an efficacious product that is sold to a farmer. And that pathway is already open to us. If there was consumer acceptance, you could do that now with our prevailing framework and legislation. But this new approach takes us beyond that. It means now we can do this kind of genetic modification outside. We can package it into spray formulations and use it directly as a pesticide without necessarily a control on who's exposed and all the very many organisms in the environment that would be exposed beyond people. We can use it just to kill, not just to modify. There are many uses of this technology that don't fit our historical understanding of how it's been used, but borrowing on that historical understanding is causing people to not realize the radical nature of using deregulation to make the technology more available.
It's the unknown, he says, that worries him most.
If you have home tinkerers or scientists like me who simply want to play in our garages outside of our university laboratories, we can be using this to create mutations, both in intended and unintended organisms at will in the environment, and not be either accountable for what we do there or have our organisms tracked. Anybody then who is selling biological material, say that's, apples or flour, whatever it is that they might be selling, could have their product lines contaminated, not by genetically modified variants of the same species of biological material that they're trying to sell, but by any number of unknown other species, bacteria, fungi, viruses, little single-celled animals, whatever they might be, that somebody tinkered with, have been caught up in the environmental chain. And then in one of our destination markets, that tinkering is detected. The comeback to that is to say, well, if everybody in the world accepts the same level of deregulation that New Zealand is proposing to lead with, then there won't be any problems with that. But that isn't correct. Everywhere, countries have safe food laws. And one of the provisions of those safe food laws is that if there's an unknown ingredient, and an unknown ingredient may be something that comes up as a potential GMO that's unauthorized, then that causes a problem. So if other jurisdictions don't know what we've made, and we haven't registered these things as having been intended to be in food or whatever the purpose of that biological material is, then that causes trade disruptions. Many countries have zero tolerance to unauthorized genetically modified organisms.
Just this week, the Consumers Union of Japan, a leading consumer advocacy group with about 30 million people, reiterated its long-standing rejection of GM foods urging New Zealand to remain a natural food exporter. In an open letter, the chairperson told New Zealand, "We hope you will remain a stable, wonderful and natural food exporter. Do not underestimate the old saying, the customer is king, and please keep New Zealand GM-free."
And the ability to detect the products of all of the gene technologies that are being described as exempt, that ability to detect is growing very quickly. It's not static. What we can't detect now easily, in a few years' time, we could very well easily be able to detect.
So you fear that this could do real damage to our clean, green reputation and also to our export market?
I'm not a business person. I'm not an exporter. I'm not an economist. But having been involved in biosafety, and in particular as an expert for the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is about the transboundary movements of GMOs, I do know some of the ramifications of this. I was also the parliamentary expert for Corngate back in the day.
During the time the accidental release of GE sweet corn was taking place, the Royal Commission was sitting, as we said previously. In his book, Nicky Hager claims that the government was less than fully forthcoming in the information it supplied to the Commission. Did you mislead the Royal Commission? Yes or no?
Did I? Most certainly
did the
not.
Government mislead the Royal Commission?
Most certainly not.
Right.
Which was exactly a string of events that could lead to, and did ultimately lead to, trade disruptions. So yes, under the circumstances that we've been living under for the last 30 or 40 years, all GMOs that are intended to be in our food are registered, risk assessed, and authorized. And then other countries know that they've been authorized, can choose to monitor for those, and can also choose to accept them in the food. We could, with an authorized GMO, sell our products to Europe, provided that we provided them with a risk assessment, they agreed to that risk assessment, and they had the ability to trace and track that ingredient. So we could do that. But now, if you have many people doing things without even the intention of ever registering those organisms, we can't live on the same rules and capability of segregation and monitoring that have assisted us for the last 30 years. Now it will be on a case-by-case basis, some of our exports being rejected because of unauthorized, unknown, genetically modified material.
On the flip side, Jack, supporters say crops can be engineered to be resistant to pests, diseases and harsh weather, and that would obviously lead to higher yields. They're saying GMOs can be designed to contain enhanced nutrients, which could contribute to better public health outcomes, and GMOs can be modified to withstand droughts, floods and other climate-related challenges, which is obviously a real problem for us now. So surely, though, this should be embraced, and isn't this a good thing?
Over the last 30 or 40 years, if there could have been a revolution in the traits of plants and animals that make them suddenly now impervious to drought and able to tolerate huge concentrations of salt simply because we changed their genes, we've had 40 years to make that demonstration. Yes, it may be at a new scale of investigation, and with the newest of our tools, we can do something that we hadn't done before. Fantastic. Bring it on. Show that is the case by developing it responsibly in the laboratory where we know who else has been exposed to whatever tools and tinkering you've done and has been properly disposed of or contained. And then when you have this product that farmers are seeking or consumers want, as soon as you have it, then you can tier the risk. You can say whether or not you think this is a high, low, very low, or negligible risk and expedite its release from a contained facility. But you don't need, I'm really not convinced you need, to let the whole world have a machine gun because you think a six-shooter will be okay.
Fox Meyer has been covering all sides of the story for Newsroom, including how gene editing technology has changed since the strict regulations were implemented.
Pretty entirely, just like really any technology that's grown with leaps and bounds over the last 2 to 3 decades, everything has shifted on an unprecedented scale and at pace. And the tools we were using back then were a lot more blunt than the ones we have now. There's CRISPR technology, which sort of lets you go in and make targeted changes to specific parts of a gene sequence, which is a much more precise tool than anything that was around when those restrictions were put in place. So either way you look at it, something does need to be updated here. And I think when you talk to the scientific community about this, whether or not they have reservations about the way we're doing it, pretty much everybody agrees that something needs to happen here.
And I should note here that does include Professor Jack Heinemann. I said to him, so put simply, you don't have an issue with gene modification, you just have an issue with how loose this bill is.
Yeah, I guess that's a way to put it.
So let's talk benefits, Fox. What are the benefits to GMOs?
Well, GMOs are not as alien as we might think. And whether or not New Zealand's currently using GMO technology, we're all consuming GMOs every day. Every crop that we consume, if you go back and look at Renaissance paintings of watermelons, for example, and see how pitiful the amount of fruit to seed ratio was in an old watermelon compared to today, we've been modifying the genes of these crops for tens of thousands of years to arrive at the ones that we enjoy now. What we're able to do now is speed up that process effectively. As long as you know what you're doing and you know how to target the changes that you want to see, it offers a lot of advantages. You can get crops that are resilient to climate change.
Fighting back on climate change requires technology. Gene editing is revolutionary for plant biology.
Can weather higher highs and lower lows, or require more or less water, or have higher yields. That's a especially important one. But there's also just conveniences. Imagine an onion that doesn't make you cry, or the red grapefruit's color is actually a product of GMO back in the 70s in America. So all sorts of things. The sky's the limit with it as far as the possibilities are concerned. It's just finding the right methods and then shoring up the regulations.
We want to be GMO has got to go.
The protests that dominated decades ago haven't eventuated this time round. In fact, it's more cheers, not jeers, from some sectors.
I think it's certainly going to be a boon, and the loudest cheers are coming from the agricultural sector. I mean, for them, they're looking at markets in Australia that are forecast to have these billion-dollar returns on GMO products because, again, your product is more resilient. You can produce more of it. People will pay a higher premium in some cases for higher quality things, unless the organic brand is more valuable to them on a personal level. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me you can get more bang for your buck out of something this way, and the thing you're investing in is more likely to weather a given storm.
So it sounds win-win, but like Professor Heinemann said earlier, it's a blunt tool.
Well, I think it sounds kind of scary on its face, and maybe that's what happened the first time around. I think people are a lot more used to the idea of these sort of technologies today, especially in a medical setting. I mean, the medical applications of gene technology is extremely useful for stuff like leukemia.
I just want to briefly illustrate some of those benefits. And the first that springs to mind is in the CAR T-cell therapy. This treatment has been clinically proven to effectively treat the cancers of a handful of people who were able to participate in its trial. But this move today will give greater access to treatments like this to more New Zealanders.
So it's not just the agriculture sector, but we already have medical regulations in place, and those don't look super set to change. The opposition now, there are considerations, there are more legal considerations around this, and they don't entirely conflict with the goals of the agriculture sector. They're not necessarily in opposition. It's just the way that this law or this bill is going to be designed is going to have consequences for every sector that could use it. The way it's written is that it's a broad brush approach. So it's covering all gene modification technology under one set of legislation. And one of the criticisms is that it seems like the wording used in this bill, which is very important, is a very plant biology centered set of words. And if you try to take the words that are convenient for them and apply it to all gene tech, you might run into trouble when you're trying to now legislate how fungi or microbes are going to be edited with gene technology. Do they reproduce in the same way as plants? No. So the legislation around that might be a little not fit for purpose.
So how do you get around that?
Well, I mean, I think that's going to be a question for people who design these legislations. Maybe you don't make it as broad brush. You could silo it a little bit. I think, this is going to be it's going to be interesting to look at the submissions process and public submissions for this and see what these people are saying, because the risk here that they're trying to bring up is that if this is broad brush and you're allowing basically anybody to perform gene edits essentially in their garage if they're below a certain threshold, it's going to be hard to know what's out there in the country. And that's where we get into a risk of expense and losing money, because currently as it stands, there's no GMO crops just growing out in the wild in New Zealand, and we can ship all of our produce overseas with the guarantee that there's nothing in here that's GMO. So it's like going up to customs and basically saying you have nothing to declare. That's an easy process. As soon as there's one thing out there, though, now you have something to declare, and they're going to have to run tests on all of these crops to see what's maybe in your wider shipment. Even if it's not a GMO product, maybe some of the seeds have blown over and gotten onto it. And again, that's not necessarily a problem. It's just if you don't have a list of all of the possible things there are, you have to test for everything now. And that's going to be a lot more labor intensive than having a guarantee of what's going to be there.
It does look like New Zealand will mirror the Australian regime, with regulations applied to all GMOs and a single overseeing regulator. But Australia's regulator is a fully independent body, while ours at this stage won't be. Our regulator will have independence, but will be subject to general policy directions given by the minister.
Personally, I think this makes complete sense to change it and update it. I just can't understand why you wouldn't have an independent body. Maybe they're looking to have these decisions be made quickly, but I fundamentally cannot understand why you would want to rush decision-making about something like this when we know from so many instances in the history of Aotearoa in terms of the environment, when something pernicious gets out there, it's so difficult to claw it back. This seems like one of the areas where you would really want a slow process with an independent expert group in charge of it, with no ability for an elected official of the day to guide their thinking, be that by imposing priorities or by redefining the risk framework, which is one thing that this bill allows them to do. So personally, I think it's a great idea that we should be taking another look at this. Makes a lot of sense, both in economic terms and in scientific terms and in cultural terms. I think we're ready for it. But it's going to be a matter of how much power the government retains in the decision-making here that I think is going to really set us apart from the rest of the world and how this regime is designed.
The bill is expected to be in place by year's end. This time it seems Kiwis are armed with more knowledge and education.
Fundamentally, it is a different proposition as it was 20 to 30 years ago. We are not talking about the same tools. We're talking about the same field, but a lot of fields have changed in this time. And I think that the average person today is a lot more familiar with the concept of gene tech and the consequences of gene tech as they were back then. I think it was a much scarier issue, and potentially for good reason, because again, it was a very different tool. But our ability to understand what's happening on a genetic and also on an ecosystem level is a lot more granular than it was back when this was introduced. So one way or another, it is time for an update. And I think pretty much everybody agrees with that. And if you don't agree with that, and if you think that the way that we had it was right, I'm sure that your voices will also be represented in this public submissions process. So it'll be very interesting to see how that goes, and if those high tensions still persist, or if they've been smoothed over by a more general acceptance of the fact that this is an old statute of operations here, and the technology it applies to has changed considerably.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Professor Jack Heinemann and Fox Meyer. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Jeremy Veal. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.